Anyway, the topic today is who killed the Bill of Rights, and that sounds, a little nutty. Bill of Rights. What do you mean? We live in a free society. I'm going to spend a little time telling you today how I'm not so sure that that's true. Now let's see if we get. Let's see. Now which one do I press? There we go. Okay. And maybe we just killed the computer. Sounds like everything kind of went off. Hey, Bucky, just hit the space bar. Like, hit the space bar again, or the down key, down arrow key. All right, that's the title of it. That's me, and you can move on to the next one. All right, as I said, thank you for inviting me today. It's always good to leave the heat and humidity and criminals in Mobile to come down here to the beach and see the heat, humidity, and criminals of Destin, present company excluded. For most of you that don't know me, there's my bio, and my trip here, not to Destin, but to a judgeship was, kind of typical, the political route. Some might say a political hack, but I would object to that. But I'll tell you the most interesting thing, though. 15 years ago or so, I was probably the most conservative person maybe in the state of Alabama. And I mean conservative as in I was one of 10 delegates representing Patrick J. Buchanan when he ran for president in 1996. Now, I'm just going to tell you, I don't really know what that word conservative means, but from my point of view, my views have probably changed, and I think you're going to hear a little bit of that today. A friend of mine called me actually the other day a libertarian anarchist, and I'm not quite sure what that means, but sticks and stones may break my bones and all of that, so that doesn't harm me too much. So let's get started today. It's interesting to note, if you can see that sign, that's in Manhattan there, and for those of you that can't quite see it, it says Authorized Drone Strike Zone, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. A former member of the military that had served in Iraq put 50 of those up in Manhattan about 6 months ago, and not one phone call was made to the city government of New York City. Now, I find that exceedingly strange. I mean, like I say, it's kind of funny, but does it say what we've gotten used to with the incrementalism we've gotten used to? Now, as I said, I have 2 door prizes we're going to give away in a few minutes, so if you don't have to play golf or don't have to get somewhere, hang on for a few minutes because they're 2 excellent books. They're both called The Heritage Guide to the Constitution, and it will tell you more about the Constitution than you ever learned in constitutional law classes, which from my point of view, I kind of felt like, although I've never smoked marijuana, I felt like I had smoked marijuana every time I went to one of those classes. Think about it. This may be a difficult question to ask you all, and I guess you shouldn't answer it because of fear of incriminating yourself, but how many of you, if heroin was legalized today, would go out and buy some tomorrow? Would any of you do that? Of course you wouldn't. I ask juries that a lot. And the reason you wouldn't, because you're smart enough to know that heroin would probably harm you, hurt you, addict you, whatever it would do. And that's the reason that cigarette smoking is at an all-time low now. People realize the things that harm themselves. But 100 years ago, Americans could buy any kind of narcotics that were available. They could buy any type of weapon that there was, including fully automatic machine guns. And there wasn't a federal income tax. Now, were you safe for 100 years ago, or were you safe for today? Ask yourselves that. Now, 1,500 years ago, Augustus of Hippo, or St. Augustine, had a term that he called, and this isn't sexual, but I want you to look at libido dominendi. And what that means is the lust of a person or a government to dominate and control others. And you can see that even in local groups that you might be members of. I was president of a condominium owners association for several years. And even in the condominium owners association or homeowners association, there's that lust for power. Let's start telling people what they can do. Their grass is too long. Their grass is too short. Let's order them to do this. Let's order them to do that. There are a lot of people that think that that's what's happened to this country over the past 200 years. It's kind of a natural progression of where the country's gone. But has our Bill of Rights become just a shadow of what it was in 1787? Perhaps it's our zeal to fight evil, whether it be anarchists back around 1900 or the fascist or the communist or now the terrorist. Maybe we've become just as evil. Sometimes read, watch, or listen to President Eisenhower's 1961 farewell address. It's shocking in that he foretold the future. It's available online everywhere, and listen to the entire address because he not only mentions the military-industrial complex and goes into that in full, he mentions that we shouldn't saddle our future generations with debt, which is amazing for what he said in 1961. Now, over 100 years ago, German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said of the quandary about good and evil, fighting evil, he said, "He who fights monsters should take to it that he himself does not become a monster." And when you gaze long enough into an abyss, sooner or later the abyss gazes back into you. And I can tell you as a circuit judge for 15 years, if you want to see that happen, sit as a circuit judge for a year or so. And the idea, of course, is that it's well known. Nobody here is a former narcotics officer or vice officer, are they? It's well known in that field that the departments try to transfer officers through that regularly because if you work there long enough, you become corrupted by that whole field. And the idea is has the problem become that in our zeal to fight all these evils, have we ourselves become not the free society we once have become, but have we become the less free society that we were all warned about after 9/11? Now, our nation is really an odd study in contrast. The internet gives us almost unlimited whatever you want, sexuality, seemingly freedom of speech, whatever thing you want to see. But are we free? We live in a country that in order to travel by air, our spouses and our children are forced to be searched with scanners that take nude photos and radiate them, or are physically searched in a way that would be called sexual assault if anyone else did it. And in fact, I tried a sexual abuse case, I guess it was, maybe an assault, several weeks ago, and I just couldn't help it. When I was reading the jury charge, I finished reading it and I said, unless, of course, you're a TSA agent at the airport, and then this doesn't apply to you. And you know what? There wasn't even a laughter. And I thought, well, this is kind of part of the same problem that we've got. We've got technology now capable of listening to everyone's phone calls, reading everyone's emails, matching DNA if it's available, and recognizing everyone's face. Almost 2 centuries ago, the German philosopher Wolfgang von Goethe said, "None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe themselves to be free." To make it all easier now, the National Security Agency, which was almost unknown of back in 1975, is building, almost completing, a $2 billion center out in Utah. A former employee of the center, William Binney, who resigned shortly after the 9/11 attacks. It's an excellent article, by the way, in Wired magazine this month. He made the statement, you have to really see his picture to see it. He said, "We're this close to becoming a turnkey totalitarian state." And you can, conspiracy theory, that's all been authorized by Congress now. This isn't something that they've done that is hidden. This is something that's the plan from the outside. That is something that they have done out in the open, funded by Congress. And you'll typically get the, well, I haven't done anything wrong, so I don't have anything to worry about. There are a lot of people that hadn't done anything wrong whose good names have been tarnished by this type thing. Gentlemen in Oregon or Washington who, after the Madrid train bombings, happened to be married to a Muslim but hadn't been overseas in years, was arrested after the train bombings. I say arrested, he disappeared. And because his fingerprints supposedly matched some found in Madrid. Well, after 3 weeks, he was finally released and told that was a big mistake. That really didn't happen. But as I said, he disappeared. He wasn't arrested. There was no warrant signed by any court. He just disappeared. Now, every one of you, when you became a member of, I guess everybody here's a member of the Alabama State Bar, you took the following oath. And I'm not going to go through and read it, but the following, it said that you agreed to support the Constitution of the state of Alabama and of the United States so long as I continue a citizen thereof. And you know, we forget all those things, and I reminded myself of that recently, and I actually framed the first one I had back in 1997. And for this talk, I'm going to obviously try to omit portions of the Patriot Act that have been litigated over the past few years, because if that's found to be constitutional, Mr. Benny and his theory about a turnkey totalitarian state, he's correct. If that's found to be constitutional, and we can kind of stop the discussion. Now, we got a few interesting things to talk about, and basically this is going to bring you up to date from 1900 to now on what's happened to the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights, and there are going to be some interesting things to see. The First Amendment, especially the free speech portion, has been under attack from several sources. Speech codes at the colleges, if you ever look at them, they're really outrageous. They're designed to make sure nobody ever gets their feelings hurt. And every time they've been challenged, they tend to be overturned by whatever court that they get into. Now, in 1917, President Woodrow Wilson, who is generally regarded as the first progressive president, I guess after Teddy Roosevelt, he asked Congress to enact what was called the Espionage Act. And of course, Woodrow Wilson was a former Princeton political science professor, and everybody thought he had a lot of great ideas. If you look at the reason, this was his address to Congress, the State of the Union address in 1915, of why he thought we needed the Espionage Act. If you didn't see his picture on it, I mean, you would really think it was written by somebody like Mussolini. There are citizens of the United States who have poured the poison of disloyalty into the very arteries of our national life, who have sought to bring the authority and good name of the government into contempt. Didn't we all think you had the right to do that? Let's look at the last line. I'm urging you to do nothing less than save the honor and self-respect of the nation. Such creatures of passion, disloyalty, and anarchy must be crushed out. Now that passed, and that brought about several years of our history, which has been overlooked by a lot of people. The act, which has been used aggressively, by the way, by the current administration, although the worst offending portions of it have been removed, was the basis of the famous quote that we've all heard by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, that you can't shout fire in a theater. And by the way, as a factoid, if you ever want to win a conversation at a cocktail party, it was shouting fire in a theater, not in a crowded theater. That's usually quoted, a crowded theater. Now, Holmes is regarded as one of our best Supreme Court justices. Problem is that that quote right there came affirming a 6 months conviction for a Socialist Party member who had basically done nothing more than advocate that people write their senators and congressmen and urge repeal of the Conscription Act. That's the very same thing that Daniel Webster did back in 1914 when he made his statement on the floor of Congress, very similar to that. Let's see, back up to Chicago, he sent out 15,000 leaflets asking people to write their congressman and repeal the Conscription Act. And for that, 6 months in a federal penitentiary. And that was affirmed by the Supreme Court with the majority opinion of Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. All right, I think we have the pamphlet actually there. It's very interesting to read, but look, long live the Constitution of the United States. Wake up, America. Your liberties are in danger. Assert your rights. And for that, 6 months. Daniel Webster, as I said, back in 1914, almost said the exact same thing when he was urging Congress not to enact a Conscription Act in the War of 1812. And probably if there was ever any war you needed one, it was in the War of 1812 where the country was actually invaded. But almost the exact same language, 6 months in the penitentiary. All right, Eugene Debs, many of you know his name. He's kind of perennial presidential candidate of the Socialist Party. He had deliberately not made any speeches during this time, fearing that he would be prosecuted. But he finally came forward and made a speech very similar to Schnick's speech, and urged that the Draft Act be repealed, and urged that the United States withdraw from World War I. He was also convicted in the federal court, and he was sentenced to 10 years in the state penitentiary. Once again, he ran for president the next year, which was 1920, and he received 3.4% of the popular vote while in the penitentiary, and that's one of his buttons that they put out. He was in the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, which was interesting, still exists here today, 3.4% of the vote. Now, Woodrow Wilson went out of office in 1921, and Warren G. Harding won the election. And almost universally, Warren G. Harding is regarded as probably one of the 10 worst presidents of the United States. Yet, during Harding's first year as president, he granted clemency to Eugene Debs and everyone else that had been convicted under the Espionage Act, stating of Debs, "I want the old man to spend Christmas with his wife." I think we actually had the telegram there, which is kind of cool to be able to find something like that. Telegram says, it's to the warden of the penitentiary in Atlanta, warden, U.S. Penitentiary, Atlanta, Georgia. President has commuted sentence of Eugene V. Debs to expire Christmas Day, 1921. He should be released accordingly. Warrant mailed you later. Answer, Doherty. And that's a pretty interesting thing, and to be able to find that too. Now, the next hot area that's going on right now, and any of you ought to be, frankly, looking for cases like this, is citizens who happen to be filming, either deliberately or incidentally, police performing their duties, being arrested by the police for filming them. This has been happening all over the country. Police departments in general take a dim view of being recorded while making arrests or performing their jobs in public. Thus, in spite of several federal court orders, and that means circuit court orders, I'll tell you in a minute where they are, it's not only legal to videotape police performing their actions in public, but under 42 U.S. Code 1983, to be arrested by the police for doing so, they don't have sovereign immunity.
Don't want to be watched. In Jones County, Mississippi, a highway patrolman told Pete Ayer, "Stop your RV." Pete's an activist who likes to videotape encounters with authorities.
Yes, sir.
Open that side door for me, man. Turn that camera off, dude.
What's that?
You filming?
Yeah.
Turn it off.
How come?
Are you filming me?
Yes.
Turn it off for me.
He'd broken no traffic laws, but maybe the police were suspicious of shirtless, tattooed Pete and his big trailer with New Hampshire plates. Pete's friend filmed the encounter and said,
I would like to keep everybody accountable in this situation.
Apparently this officer didn't like that. Okay. Another arrived and said,
I'm not shutting it off, officer.
Or you going to jail?
Excuse me? Sir.
The cops grabbed his camera and arrested him and his friends.
They held us in jail, wouldn't let us make phone calls.
After about 12 hours, the police let them go.
They charged me with possession of a beer in a dry county because there was one unopened beer in the refrigerator of the RV. They had nothing else to stick on me.
They couldn't charge him with filming the police because that's legal. And that's a good thing.
2 U.S. Circuit Courts of Appeals, the first and our own 11th, have said that there's a photographer, videographer's right to film police activity, and they make no distinction between a citizen photographer, journalist, and a professional journalist. The 3rd, the 4th, and the 5th circuits have said that there's a right to videotape the police, but it hadn't been conclusively established. Courts in the remaining circuits have not ruled on the issue directly, but I mean, come on, I don't know how they can't. Watch this one.
So if we wanted to reschedule this whole thing for when he's here or something, I think that would be a fair arrangement or something.
We're
just not going to allow you to be here unless he's here and he gives permission. I have no authorization whatsoever to allow anybody onto the property.
Okay. And also, I'd rather not be video and audio recorded.
Okay.
So I'd like to shut that off right now.
I'd rather not.
Well, I'm asking, it's illegal right now what you're doing. We don't want to be audio, video
You already got
recorded.
your consent, though, when he came up and said
Well,
that you
then I
were-
told you I want it off now, so you should shut it off now. So shut it off.
Try that.
Is there any law that says that he has to?
Absolutely.
What is the law?
Absolutely, you need to have a person's verbal permission. And I just
We
told
got
him-
your permission.
You got
I
my
just told you I
permission.
want
He
it
just
off.
told you he wanted it off. I didn't give you my permission either, and it's a felony if you're taping.
You guys
and-
are public-
and recording that.
Public people here. You have every
So
right
shut
to.
off shut it off, or you're going to be coming with me.
Okay.
Already?
Before we click, one of my judges down there said, I can't understand it. What language are they speaking? And I said, Don, they're Yankees. You just got to listen a little harder to it. This may be the most frightening one, a motorcyclist riding, and what would you do if this came after you? Get the gun in his hand?
Get off the motorcycle, state
Well,
police.
it turned out later he was a plainclothes highway patrolman who ticketed the rider of the motorcycle. And when it appeared on YouTube, though, he was indicted for wiretapping, which was later, of course, dismissed. But if I saw that coming at me, I know what I'd do. The next is a CBS News.
Put that camera away. Turn the camera on. Put the camera away. Put the camera away. My man, you heard what I just said, man? Now get the camera out of here right now. You get your hands off that camera.
Turned violent when a Newark police officer arrested our CBS 2 photographer covering the story.
Stop! Put your hands behind your back. No, he's going with me. He's going with me.
You can't arrest
I can do whatever I want.
The camera kept rolling as the officer
Thanks,
put
Ben.
our photographer Jim Portermine in a chokehold, then handcuffed him. Witnesses.
That's it. All right, and moving on, Second Amendment. Gun rights. They have undergone a real change over the past 5 years. First case being, before we go to that, I want to show you take you through a time capsule and show you the Attorney General back in 1995 and speak.
We want to have, as part of the gun initiative, though, an informational campaign to really change the hearts and minds of people in Washington, D.C., and in particular our young people. They are saturated in the media and in entertainment, or by the entertainment industry, with violence. And I think too many of our
You gotta have a little
young
fun every
people, in
once in a
particular
while.
our young men, are fascinated with violence, and in particular fascinated with guns. And what we need to do is change the way in which people think about guns, especially young people, and make it something that's not cool, that it's not acceptable, it's not hip to carry a gun anymore.
I've been working on that myself. Of course, who needs a gun when you have 8 federal agents guarding you 24/7? But as I said, I've personally been working on what he's been talking about in my spare time. Bucky, if you'll give us a click and we will. Can't get good help anymore, can you? Try to get. There you go.
I like the way they look. I like the shiny steel and the polished wood. I don't care if they're big or small. They're for sale. Hell, I want them all. I like guns. I like guns. I like guns.
That's yours truly if you can't make it out.
Well, I really like 22 now. 45 lever with the Winchester tag. I like my double barrel. Had it most of my life. 357 was a present from my wife. I like guns. I like the way they look. I like the shiny steel and the polished wood. I don't care if they're big or small. They're for sale and hell, I want them all. I like guns. I like guns. I like guns. Trying to take the guns off of us, 'cause I ain't gonna shoot anyone, and no one shoots at me, 'cause I got a gun.
By the way, accidental gun deaths are an all-time low in our history since they started recording it. But to show you why we need a Second Amendment and why it now has been applied to the states, take a look at this. Well, first, we got the Louisiana Constitution, and that needs to be there. Because at the time of Hurricane Katrina, the Second Amendment had not been applied to the states through the 14th Amendment. So it's real important to look at Louisiana's Constitution. All right.
No one will be able to be armed. We will take all weapons.
It was a human drama with emotions and tensions running high. Patty Connie is still trying to recover physically and emotionally.
They really did a number on me.
From the day police forced her from her home.
It was traumatic. All of a sudden, they were banging on the front door, the side door, and the back door, and they said, "Let us in."
Patty tried to explain. She was on dry land, she had plenty of food and water, and didn't want to abandon her dogs. But it didn't matter.
If you see 6 or 8 police that look like linebackers pushing you in a corner, you're in shock. I'm saying, look at all my food. I got plenty of food. They kept pushing me back, and ended up like this.
Then, Patty showed them a small revolver she was carefully holding in the palm of her hand. A camera crew was there to capture what unfolded next.
I said, "It's not even loaded." And I dropped it on the floor.
You got a gun?
Well, they punched me in the face. Look at my black and blue marks. Look at what they did to me. They dragged me out of here. I really thought they were going to kill me. I really did.
There's an interesting book that goes into all of that. But in the past 5 years, we've had 2 Supreme Court decisions. First was the Heller decision that held that the well-managed militia, et cetera, that was an individual right to own a firearm. And then after that, let's see, I think we have the C.L.E.
I don't see how there's any contradiction between reading the second clause as a personal guarantee and reading the first one as assuring the existence of a militia, not necessarily a state-managed militia, because the militia that resisted the British was not state-managed. But why isn't it perfectly plausible, indeed reasonable, to assume that since the framers knew that the way militias were destroyed by tyrants in the past was not by passing a law against militias, but by taking away the people's weapons? That was the way militias were destroyed. The 2 clauses go together beautifully. Since we need a militia, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
We'll give away our first prize today. Does anybody know why General Gage in Boston sent his British troops to Lexington and Concord? Anybody know why? You got it. Come on, you get the Heritage Guide to the Constitution. Yay! Let me tell you, I looked through 12 high school history books, and none of them had that in there. Good for you. All right, we got one more factoid coming up in a minute. We'll see if anybody else gets. 2 years later, then the long-anticipated case came up. Is the Second Amendment going to be applied to the states through the 14th Amendment, generally like the other members or other bills of rights had done? And that case was the McDonald versus City of Chicago case. City of Chicago had an incredibly restrictive gun ban, basically. And let's see. Can you get that one up, okay? Let's see. There we go. The young lawyer on the left, I think he was 34 when it all started. He had actually been hired by the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian group, to file these lawsuits. For everybody that thinks, the NRA is the big bad guy in gun control, they actually tried to sabotage the lawsuit, the Heller lawsuit and the McDonald lawsuit, because they were afraid they would lose. They felt like they had gained so much over the past few years, they didn't want to test what the courts would do. So that shows, sometimes you get old and too conservative. And as I said, this case pitted the younger Alan Gura, Mr. McDonald, 76 years old, who wouldn't violate Chicago's gun ban, although he had been burglarized, I think, 14 times, versus Mayor Daley at the time, who had a personal security force of 12. Supreme Court held at that time that, yes, through the 14th Amendment, that the Second Amendment applied to the states and the local communities. You know, it's interesting that, and we may have one more after that. Let's see. All right, that's where I want to be. We think we invent everything in America, and maybe that's a great way to be, but it's amazing to read the English Bill of Rights of 1688, and it's almost a duplication of our Declaration of Independence. One of the complaints that the Parliament had against James II was that he raised and kept standing armies within the kingdom in time of peace without consent of Parliament, and he quartered soldiers contrary to law. And it sounds just like our Third Amendment. And there are very few cases dealing with the Third Amendment. I'll refer you to your handout dealing with those. But what happened in New Orleans could have easily been brought as some of the Third Amendment cases, and I'll show you that in just a minute. Many people got what happened in New Orleans after Katrina confused. They'll say, well, there was a declaration of martial law. Well, there wasn't. Louisiana has no provision dealing with martial law. If you search Westlaw or any of the sources on martial law, you'll only find, number one, you won't find anything in the U.S. Code. You'll find a reference in the Code of Federal Regulations, and you'll find a case right after the Civil War in which a Confederate sympathizer was being tried by a military tribunal. And what the Supreme Court basically said, the easy test about whether or not martial law is proper is if the courts are still open, then martial law isn't proper. So what happened in Louisiana and New Orleans and specifically was just pandemonium. You had regular U.S. Army troops in New Orleans, I think in violation of the Posse Comitatus Act. You had soldiers and police in New Orleans entering people's homes without warrants, taking their guns, expelling them from their houses, and in many times sleeping and taking over their houses. I think we have, let's go to the next slide.
Today in New Orleans, they got a lot tougher on the holdouts. Not only the flooded areas, but New Orleans' driest and wealthiest neighborhoods too. Going street by street, house to house.
We need to make sure too that whenever we knock on doors, people refuse to leave. We need to make note, call it in.
They say there are no orders to use force, just strong persuasion, sometimes entering open houses with guns drawn, and instructions to disarm anyone inside. That happened today in this wealthy neighborhood where homeowners had armed themselves to protect their mansions.
They were a little bit threatened because our weapons were bigger than their weapons.
It is an uncomfortable job to do this in an American city. This guard unit occupied a church, using it as a base camp. Chris Montgomery says he'd rather be in Iraq than patrolling American neighborhoods.
Walking up and down these streets, you don't want to think about the stuff that you're going to have to do. Somebody pops around the corner.
Let me shoot in America.
Yeah.
Remember, former presidential advisor and now Chicago mayor, interestingly enough, Rahm Emanuel said, never let a good crisis go to waste. Well, this statement also highlights, like I said, some of the abuses that took place in New Orleans when the regular U.S. Army troops entered New Orleans along with National Guard troops. The reason the regular Army had to be there is because most of the Louisiana National Guard was overseas. And just while I mention this, they say the group that helped more out during Hurricane Katrina, and it was hardly ever mentioned, is the Louisiana Game and Fish Department. I've read every book on Katrina, and just by and large, those were the folks that helped they and the Coast Guard more than anyone else. Okay, let's see. This is probably the time to go to the other book. Well, you've jumped it because I don't want to confuse you. I don't want to give you any clues. There's one part of one of the Bill of Rights, that has never been applied to the states, although one justice said it has been. Does anybody know what that is? Just one now. One part, and if you think about it, it makes sense. One part of the Bill of Rights, one Bill of Rights that hadn't been applied to the states. We can't have two winners. Come on. Close. And I tell you what, Third Amendment, because it was applied to New York, to the New York prison guards, the New York National Guard took over the prisons up there, expelled the prison guards. The prison guards had barracks as part of their compensations, and the court held, hey, that's the Third Amendment applied there. It is, and it makes sense. It is the provision that says excessive bail shall not be required. And that makes sense when you start thinking about it. Duh. A case could never get old enough to get to the Supreme Court, or shouldn't get old enough to get to the Supreme Court about a bail or a bond issue. Now, the rest of the amendment about cruel and unusual punishment, yeah, it has, but it's just that portion about bail or bond. Of course, Alabama has the same provision in its constitution, but you'd be surprised how many lawyers will file petitions with me, motions asking for bail to be reduced, and they will quote the United States Constitution. And frankly, the only reason I found that is I started doing one of these long orders, and I said this was incorporated and couldn't find it. And then the Heritage Guide, I think, is the one that told me. Fourth Amendment, let's go through that briefly. I never thought, let's back up one more moment. There you go, there's New Orleans, Louisiana, quartering troops. Did anybody ever think you'd see the descendants of Washington, Madison, Adams, etc., out at the airport being strip searched? I guess that's called incrementalism, because I never thought I would see it. The case that allowed magnetometers back in 1972, the Epperson case, but there were several, the quote was, the use of the device, the magnetometer, you walk through them all the time, they don't touch you, of the device, unlike frisking, cannot possibly be an annoying, frightening, and perhaps humiliating experience. Well, slippery slope, you've heard that argument? There's your slippery slope. Okay, let's go to the next one, and it even is, you've seen hundreds of these things. And the next is even more interesting, because in addition to the unreasonable search and seizure, we've got a U.S. senator that is immune from detention going to and from sessions of Congress, but of course they contend that we didn't detain him, we just wouldn't let him leave the airport. So that's something that's going to be decided at some point. I sure hope they decide the right way, but things have been going great. One thing that's interesting, let's see, get you to that point. Yeah, one win recently for the Fourth Amendment has been a case called United States versus Jones. It got a lot of press. It was the GPS case, where a GPS device was installed on a drug dealer's car. Supreme Court held 9-0 that you had to have a warrant for that. Interestingly enough, there was a warrant in that case, but it had expired. And nevertheless, the agents went ahead and installed it anyway. Interesting, if you all don't know about the OYA's project, they put all of the oral arguments and all of the opinions from the Supreme Court online now. And it's really interesting to listen to some of the cases. I'm sure plenty of them are boring, but Justice C.L.E. had delivered the opinion for the court, but Justice Breyer had a very good observation from that case.
If you win this case, then there is nothing to prevent the police or the government from monitoring 24 hours a day the public movement of every citizen of the United States. And the difference between the monitoring and what happened in the past is memories are fallible, computers aren't. And no one, or at least very rarely, sends human beings to follow people 24 hours a day. That occasionally happens. But with the machines, you can't. So if you win, you suddenly produce what sounds like 1984 from their brief. I understand they have an interest in perhaps dramatizing that, but maybe overly. But it still sounds like it. And so what protection is there, if any, once we accept your view of the case from this slight futuristic scenario?
Well, fortunately, the vote was 9-0, and they got that issue. There's been a disturbing trend, really since about 1980, to militarize the police departments. And it really came about as a result of the so-called war on drugs, but also giving surplus weaponry to the local police departments. And for 10 years, I was the director of what we call the Mobile County Court Police, and that's the police force that guards Government Plaza. And believe me, they've never seen a toy that they don't want. And you can look around the country, and there are police departments, small ones, that have armored personnel carriers. They have everything in the world. The problem is there's a tendency to want to use those things once you get them. Until about, I guess it was the 1970s, nighttime search warrants were illegal in the state of Alabama, as were no-knock search warrants. But those have become routine, at least around the country. This one in particular is pretty disturbing in Utah. By the way, this is the prior resident. It was for a search of his residence. This is police footage.
Police, search warrant! Police, search warrant! Search warrant! Search warrant! Get on the...
He's dead.
Clear this house.
No, what's going on?
Keep going through.
Clear this house.
Stay with me.
I got it.
If you want more information about these type things, if you go to the Cato Institute's website, they keep an interactive map of these type things. One of the worst recently was these life alert things, I fall and I can't get up. An elderly man that had rolled over at night and set one off. And the police show up supposedly for a welfare check, and he comes to the door all groggy and says, "I'm fine, get out of here," slams the door. Well, before it was over, they blasted the door down and killed him. So if you're looking for that story, it says, "We're from the police and we're here to," and help is scratched and it says, "kill you." But it was the man's niece who lived nearby, and the operator from the Lifeline place offered to mediate it, and, anyway, he was killed. That's the problem when you have all that type of militarization. And believe me, I kind of came out of that culture, so I know where they're coming from. I'm going to show you one more thing, and then we're going to take some questions, because we're long overdue. 1951, 52, a case that most people have forgotten about. During the Korean War, Korean police action, President Truman seized the steel mills in response to a threatened strike that was about to take place. Back then we used to manufacture steel. It wasn't all made in Japan or wherever, China, wherever it's made now. And he seized the steel mills as opposed to invoking the Taft-Hartley Act, which would have allowed a cooling off period. Well, within days, the steel companies had filed a petition. First, they filed for TRO but didn't get it, filed a petition for a preliminary injunction. And during the petition for a preliminary injunction, the following dialogue took place. By the way, the order seizing the steel mills cited no legal authority. It said, "under my inherent power as President of the United States." The dialogue that took place was the court, who was U.S. District Judge David Pine, the District of Columbia, said, "Now you contend," this is to the U.S. Attorney, "you contend that exercising powers where there's no statute makes a case stand on a different plane, a preferred plane." And Mr. Baldridge is the U.S. Attorney. "Correct. Our position is that there's no power in the courts to restrain the President," and I say Secretary Sawyer, the Commerce Secretary, "is the alter ego of the President and not subject to injunctive orders of this court. If the President directs Mr. Sawyer to take you into custody right now and have you executed in the morning, you say there's no power by which the court may intervene, even by habeas corpus? Well, if there are statutes protecting me, I would have a remedy. What statutes would protect you? I do not recall any at the moment." And let's go to the next slide. The next day, the papers it was literally an outcry from the papers. Dictator Truman, what does he think he's doing, etc. Even Lyndon Johnston called it a presidential power grab. It's interesting now that was 1951. Fast forward to 2011, and what do we have? We have a U.S. citizen killed in, was it Yemen, Somalia, whatever, Anwar al-Awlaki, a terrorist. For all I know, he was a terrorist. But we had the same thing happen. The Fifth Amendment says no person. First of all, it doesn't say a citizen, no person. For those of you that do criminal law, death penalty cases take about 3 weeks to try before you can sentence someone to death, and about 20 years of appeals. But the operative phrase is, nor deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. I want to play you a short clip next of the Attorney General. But what he says in it, he says the Constitution guarantees due process. It doesn't guarantee judicial process. The problem is he doesn't say due process of law. The other thing to listen for is he uses the technical phrase law of war. And I knew that woke me up somewhere, and I'll tell you about what the law of war is in just a minute.
Any such use of lethal force by the United States will comply with the 4 fundamental law of war principles governing the use of force. The principle of necessity requires that the target have definite military value. The principle of distinction requires that only lawful targets, such as combatants, civilians directly participating in hostilities and military objectives, may be targeted intentionally. Under the principle of proportionality, the anticipated collateral damage must not be excessive in relation to the anticipated military advantage. And finally, the principle of humanity requires us to use weapons that will not inflict unnecessary suffering. These principles do not forbid the use of stealth or technologically advanced weapons. In fact, the use of advanced weapons may help to ensure that the best intelligence is available for planning and carrying out operations, and the risk of civilian casualties can be minimized or avoided altogether. Some have argued that the president is required to get permission from a federal court before taking action against a United States citizen who is a senior operational leader of al-Qaeda or associated forces. This is simply not accurate. Due process and judicial process are not one and the same, particularly when it comes to national security. The Constitution guarantees due process. It does not guarantee judicial process.
So you caught that term, law of war, which is, normally you say laws of war if you were just talking about it. Here's what we mean by law of war. Let's get through that. Can't see that good in the red didn't show up. It is the 100 or so treaties that the United States is signatory to that govern the conduct of war around the world. The Geneva Convention would be one of them, but there are hundreds more than that. Interestingly enough, if you look at one of the websites, it's called lawofwar.org, there is there's testimony from one of the Japanese war crimes trials, and one of the U.S. Victims, one of the U.S. servicemen who was held by the Japanese testified, I think the case was called Sawada. He testified that he was, I can't remember the term they called it, but what they did to him with water, he felt like he was drowning, which was pretty interesting. I wonder where that came from. Here's our other book giveaway. Does anybody know what treaty the United States is signatory to that forbids the use of hollow point bullets, dum-dum bullets, or first forbade the use of dum-dum bullets in warfare? Hollow point or dum-dum bullets. The FBI agent got this one wrong, so that's why I had to keep using it. One of those, it's kind of silly, but it is the Hague Convention. I feel like Ben Stein, the Hague Convention of 1899. Most people say the Geneva Convention, but it's the Hague Convention. Okay, I want to mention one more thing to you. If you ever want to read about pretrial publicity and how insane it can be in operating a trial, pretrial and post-trial, read the Sam Shepard case, The Fugitive. I moved a case from Mobile to Birmingham. It was elected official. He was charged with something. And you read that case, and it is just insane. The poor lawyers tried to conduct a poll like all of us would do, and the newspaper ran an editorial that says what the lawyers are doing is non-judicial, nonsensical, and it was just unbelievable. Said they ought to be disbarred for it. But it is kind of the roadmap to go by whenever you have a situation like that. Lastly, Bucky, just flip ahead. The Ninth Amendment. Everybody forgets the Ninth. They call it the Lost Amendment. I got to show you this one. We've run out of money. Everybody says I have to tell you this one. I wrote an essay in last Sunday's Mobile paper. I guess it's online everywhere. But there's a provision in the Alabama Constitution that requires the courts to be adequately and reasonably funded. Our funding is approximately 50% of what it was 6 years ago. I think you can about take judicial notice that that is not adequate and reasonably funded. If you've got a jury trial setting right now, you better take advantage of it. Here's my best line, though, in the letter. You couldn't read the red before that, but the red said, the red portion said that I think it says the sole purpose and only object of state government is the protection of people and the life, liberty, or property. And when government performs other functions, it is usurpation and oppression. Okay, any questions? I got to think of another question to give the book away, or we're going to have to do it randomly here. Certainly, y'all. I know I come across like some raving left-wing lunatic when it's actually probably the opposite. But you see enough of this, and it's pretty shocking. Come on, somebody. Got to have a question. Ben Stein would say, anybody. Come on. Oh, we got to see the Ninth Amendment. Ninth Amendment, Buck, if you can find it. People talk about the 10th Amendment, all the conservative groups. Oh, we got to enforce the 10th Amendment. It has never been enforced by any court that makes any difference. The Ninth Amendment's the interesting one. It's called the Lost Amendment. It was the basis of Griswold versus Connecticut. You know, that was the zinger question that they asked Governor Romney during one of the debates. What do you think about birth control and, the states? And he says, I don't know, I guess he handled it well, but it's actually a very important question because conservatives at the time were afraid that liberal activist judges would use the Ninth Amendment to go around and do stuff like Griswold. But I tell you what it does is it really says that the individuals retain all the natural rights that they had at the signing of the Constitution. And that's real important if you can get a court to enforce it. But, okay, anybody? Natural rights? Anybody want to say anything about that? Is anybody awake? Let me tell you, I'm not pointing y'all out, but I have a theory that, and I pulled the slide out, that most people go to work, the ones that work. They go to work every day. They go home, depending on their preference. They either get drunk or stoned and watch reality shows all night and fall asleep and get up and do the same thing. And they don't care about the Constitution. They don't care who's going to be elected. That's just the way it is. And maybe that's better. That's why the undertitle to this was, Are We Living in a Matrix? Where none of this even matters. And that's actually kind of a strange theory of cosmology, that we're all living on a two-dimensional brain here, a projection from trillions of light years away. Maybe that is. Maybe that's why we've got so many people that don't care what's happening, and you can't make them care what's happening. But it's a definite change from, I first got involved in politics, if you can imagine. My father's law partner was the first Republican, from South Alabama at least, that was elected to the Alabama House of Representatives. I think it was 1966. So I was 7 years old putting bumper stickers on cars, and people cared then. And there's no care. There doesn't seem to be a caring now. I overrode a jury and sentenced a guy to death about 7 years ago. And the first time I'd done it, a little nervous. I got not one call, not one letter of protest, not one email, nothing. Another judge had a decision to make whether to allow a pit bull to be killed. He got over 600 emails or phone calls. A pit bull and a human being. I mean, it really maybe shows you where people's hearts lie. So, anybody else? What did the Declaration of Independence say about Native Americans? Does anybody know? Declaration of Independence said something about Native Americans. Wasn't too flattering, frankly, but does anybody? It says that the king, let me see if I can find the exact words, and I'm going to let you go. If not, I can paraphrase it pretty well. It's one of those things that they do not read to you on television because it's not politically correct. Well, they say that the king has set upon the inhabitants of our territories the merciless Indian savages who have no rules of war and whose only whatever aim is blood and gore. Nobody. All right. Anybody else? Anybody? Pick somebody random that's still here. Listen, thank you so much. Sorry about the late